What if I told you that one of the darkest secrets in ancient Rome was not hidden in blood-stained arenas or battlefields, but in the silent corridors of an emperor's palace where fathers were forced to hold torches while their daughters were destroyed? This is not a myth. This is not a rumor. This is a piece of forbidden history so chilling that even Rome tried to erase it from its memory. And yet, archaeological ruins, broken ledgers, and survivor graffiti whisper the truth. The empire that gave us roads, laws, and aqueducts also industrialized human violation with bureaucratic precision. This is the shocking truth about Caligula, the boy who rose to power as Rome's golden child and turned into the monster who made senators illuminate their own daughters' torment. The storm outside couldn't mask the screams. Thunder rolled across the Mediterranean night, shaking the marble walls of the imperial palace. But inside, the torchlight revealed something worse than death. Senator Marcus Claudius stood frozen, his trembling hand gripping bronze, forced to provide light for what should never have been seen. Behind the emperor's chamber door, his 14-year-old daughter was no longer a child. She was entry 247 in a ledger that reduced innocence to numbers. This is the kind of dark history that doesn't make it into textbooks, the kind of hidden secrets that the Roman Empire buried under propaganda and monuments. But the ruins don't lie. The ledgers don't lie. And the torch holders still remain echoing with the weight of what they once illuminated. Think about it, an empire that celebrated itself as the pinnacle of civilization was quietly running a machine of systematic abuse, transforming daughters into inventory items and fathers into accomplices. This wasn't random cruelty. This wasn't impulsive madness. This was administration. Every scream recorded, every victim numbered, every father broken. Caligula the emperor, who once charmed Rome with his smile, perfected the art of turning human suffering into policy, into revenue, into spectacle. Why does this matter today? Because viral history teaches us something dangerous. When absolute power meets cold procedure, evil no longer looks like chaos, it looks like paperwork. Rome's disturbing past is not just about gladiators and emperors gone mad. It's about how a system can weaponize love, family, and duty until even a father's torch becomes a tool of compliance. So here is the question that will haunt this entire story. How did Rome, the empire that claimed divine order, descend into a factory of horror where children were processed like grain and senators were trained to betray their own blood? Stay with me, because to understand how Caligula transformed private depravity into public policy, we need to go back to the night when thunder shook Rome and a father learned that sometimes holding a flame meant extinguishing everything he ever loved. March of 37 CE. Tiberius, the paranoid old emperor, lay dead in his villa at Capri. Rome suffocated under decades of suspicion, and cruelty erupted in celebration. At last, the Senate cheered, the people rejoiced, the legions shouted their approval. The empire had a new leader, a young man who promised to be everything his predecessor was not. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but everyone called him by a nickname born on military campaigns, Caligula Little Boots, son of the beloved General Germanicus, grandson of the revered Agrippina. The elder heir to the dynasty of Augustus Caligula looked like the answer to Rome's desperate prayers. For once, it seemed ancient Rome would trade paranoia for prosperity, tyranny for benevolence. At first, the dream appeared real. Caligula's opening gestures painted him as a savior. He granted bonuses to soldiers, won the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, cut taxes for ordinary citizens, and staged gladiatorial games so extravagant that Rome had not seen their like since Augustus. The people adored him. Senators whispered in relief, "At last, dignity has returned." To a city worn down by suspicion, exile, and endless trials, the young emperor's charm was intoxicating. He smiled, he laughed, he walked among the people. He seemed too good to be true. And maybe he was. Because even as Rome celebrated, shadows stirred inside the palace. Slaves disappeared quietly. A kitchen servant who had risen before dawn for 10 years failed to report one morning. A merchant's daughter never came home from delivering cloth to the palace gates. At first, explanations sounded harmless. They ran away. They were dismissed. They were reassigned. But weeks later, bodies surfaced in the Tiber bearing marks that soldiers could not explain. It was easier not to ask questions. Easier to believe that the golden boy of Rome could not possibly hide darkness. Easier to bury truth beneath celebration. But history does not let us stay comfortable for long. 6 months into his reign in October 37th, CE, the story shifted forever. Caligula fell ill violently, mysteriously, terrifyingly. For weeks, Rome held its breath. Crowds filled temples, priests sacrificed by the thousands, families whispered desperate prayers into the night. Would the empire lose its new hope before it had even begun? And then, against all odds, he survived. Rome exhaled in relief. Citizens slaughtered cattle in thanksgiving. Senators ordered celebrations. The nightmare seemed over, but survivors often returned changed, and Caligula returned with fire in his eyes. Ancient historian Suetonius would later write, "He returned different, as if the illness had burned away his humanity." To those closest to him, the shift was immediate. To the public, it took time. At first, he asked for unusual entertainments, odd rituals, bizarre jokes that felt unsettling but harmless. Rome excused him. He was young, still learning, still grieving the shadow of Tiberius. Surely he would grow into the role. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had already cracked. It began with the Senate's wives. Invitations appeared polite, official, impossible to refuse. A dinner here, a private audience there. Those who declined were reminded that refusal was disloyalty. Those who attended left silent faces, pale, unwilling to speak of what occurred. Then noble boys, barely teenagers, were honored with palace positions where silk and rouge replaced armor and education. Still, Rome looked away. He is young. He will mature. He will learn restraint. But restraint never came. Instead, something else took its place. Conviction of divinity. Having faced death and survived, Caligula no longer believed he was mortal. Illness had not humbled him, it had crowned him. He returned to the Senate not as a man seeking cooperation, but as a god demanding worship. And gods do not negotiate. This was the true dark history of Rome's golden boy, the transformation of private eccentricity into public entitlement, of whispers into commands. When a ruler believes himself divine, then every crime becomes ritual, every cruelty becomes policy, every desire becomes law. Rome did not yet see it, but the machine was already being built. The forbidden history we now call madness was at the time rationalized as divine will. So here lies the disturbing truth. Caligula's rise was not a sudden fall from grace. It was a seduction. First hope, then doubt, then silence, then complicity. And by the time the city realized what it had embraced, it was too late. Because systems of power once established do not collapse at the first sign of horror. They expand, they feed, they demand. Pause for a moment. Ask yourself, why do societies excuse the first cracks in power? Because hope blinds us, because fear silences us, because we prefer the illusion of safety to the admission of danger. Rome was no different. The senators who had once cheered Caligula's arrival would soon stand in torchlit corridors broken by their own silence. Fathers who had once toasted the young emperor would find themselves holding flames for their daughter's destruction. This is why the hidden secrets of ancient Rome matter today. because they remind us that evil rarely announces itself. It begins as charm, as generosity, as relief from past suffering. It arrives with laughter and open hands. And then one day, you wake up to find that the man you trusted has turned himself into a god, and you are no longer a citizen, you are property. So was Caligula truly insane, or was he simply the logical outcome of absolute power dressed as hope? That is the question historians still debate, and the question that should unsettle us most. Because when we look closely, the line between savior and tyrant, between protection and destruction, is thinner than we want to admit. And this was only the beginning. The generosity was over. By the summer of 38 CE, whispers spread that Rome's golden boy had begun keeping ledgers not for grain, not for tax, but for human beings. At first, the entries seemed isolated, a merchant's daughter here, a senator's wife there. But slowly the pattern became impossible to ignore. Names became numbers, people became inventory, and cruelty became procedure. Inside the palace archives, scribes scratched their quills across parchment with chilling detachment. Victims were catalogued with the same precision as livestock age, height, lineage, compliance rating. Some entries even carried marginal notes about revenue potential. This was no longer a tyrant's whim. This was an administration. The disturbing truth of ancient Rome was that the empire that built aqueducts and roads was now building infrastructure for horror. Caligula understood something deeper than violence. Death was too quick, execution too merciful. The real power lay not in killing enemies, but in dismantling them piece by piece, destroying what they loved most, while forcing them to witness it. Senators who opposed him did not meet the sword. Instead, their wives and daughters appeared in the ledgers, reduced to acquisitions. Their punishment was survival, twisted into humiliation. By then, palace architects were given strange orders. New chambers were constructed with acoustic precision, designed so that sounds carried into waiting rooms. Fathers would sit outside, forced to listen while holding torches. The emperor requires witnesses, Helicon, the so-called master of pleasures, explained. Documentation is essential to divine justice. These words, spoken without irony, signaled the transformation of private depravity into state ritual. This was the moment when Rome's hope curdled into fear. A senator might oppose a tax proposal in the morning and find his daughter listed in the ledgers by evening. A magistrate who ruled against the emperor discovered his wife missing by nightfall. And still, no one spoke. No one protested. Because in Caligula's Rome, silence was the only survival strategy. The cruelty escalated with mathematical precision. Witnesses later described how senators sat in banquets, pretending to enjoy delicacies, while screams echoed from adjoining chambers. Husbands were forced to comment on their wives' performance, knowing refusal would doom their children. The forbidden history of these dinners was never meant to be remembered. Yet fragments of records remain, scribes noting attendance accounts, tallying payments, guest lists, detailing who participated and who stayed silent. Bureaucracy turned atrocity into routine. Imagine the psychological warfare: fathers watching daughters vanish into chambers, mothers clutching sons dressed in silk instead of armor, children raised in fear that their family name alone marked them for acquisition. Power had shifted from the battlefield to the dining hall, from open violence to systematic humiliation. And humiliation left deeper scars than execution. By late 38 CE, the ledgers reached hundreds of entries, at least 300 women and 300 boys, carefully documented, processed, evaluated. This wasn't impulsive madness, it was industrial logic. Performance metrics were introduced. Negative assessments led to retraining, euphemism for renewed torture. Positive compliance earned victims trivial rewards, an extra meal, a cleaner cell. Even mercy was a weapon. The emperor, who believed himself divine, now spent hours reviewing spreadsheets of human misery, demanding efficiency, expansion, optimization. And yet the most terrifying element wasn't Caligula's cruelty. It was the compliance of everyone around him. Senators toasted him while their wives disappeared. Soldiers obeyed orders knowing children would never return. Bureaucrats dipped quills into ink recording destruction with the same calm they used for tax records. Evil was no longer just an act, it was a career. Archaeological excavations centuries later would confirm what the texts whispered. Torch holders still stand in palace ruins, spaced exactly 8 feet apart, designed for fathers to hold light steady. Scratched graffiti has been found on marble walls, "We are the damned who breathe." Fragments of ledgers preserve cold numbers beside Roman names long forgotten. These are not legends. These are receipts of horror. But even evidence cannot capture the isolation of those trapped inside. Rome was an empire of millions, yet inside those corridors, each victim stood utterly alone. Fathers realized their torches would not save, only illuminate. Mothers discovered their silence protected no one. Children understood too early that survival required compliance. The city that called itself eternal had become a theater where love was weaponized, family was dismantled, and humanity was priced. Ask yourself this: what do you do when silence is the only shield left, but silence also makes you complicit? That was the choice senators faced. Break the silence, and your family is destroyed. Keep silent, and you survive long enough to watch another man's family destroyed. That is the disturbing past of the Roman Empire, a civilization where compliance was survival, and survival meant betrayal. By the time 39 CE arrived, Caligula no longer hid behind charm. The mask of sanity had fallen. The ledgers expanded. The temple of divine service opened its marble doors. Fathers began torch duty with increasing frequency, and senators walked the forum with haunted eyes, asking themselves a question they dared not speak aloud. When will it be my turn? This was the true viral history of Caligula's Rome, the moment when cruelty ceased being random and became systematic. The moment when families became data. The moment when Rome's golden boy turned into the architect of an empire of fear. And yet, as terrifying as this sounds, the worst was still to come. Because Caligula had not yet shown his ultimate innovation, forcing fathers to illuminate their daughters' destruction with their own hands. That moment, the torch, the scream, the ledger entry would redefine what absolute power meant, and Rome would never recover from it. There are moments in history where horror no longer hides in shadows, it wears a crown. The night Rome would never forget was carefully staged, orchestrated like theater. By 39 CE, the palace ledgers had become routine, but now Caligula wanted something more. He wanted spectacle. He wanted proof that no bond, neither blood nor honor nor faith, could withstand his will. The orders were simple yet chilling. Fathers were summoned to the palace at dusk. They were handed torches and told to hold them steady. No explanations, no negotiations, just obedience. As marble corridors swallowed their footsteps, they began to understand. The torches were not for light. They were for exposure. They would be forced to illuminate the destruction of their own families. This was torch duty. Fathers stood shoulder to shoulder in chambers built with cruel precision. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors. Acoustic walls carried every sound, every scream straight into their ears. In the center, victims were paraded like sacrifices, their names read from the ledgers as if announcing honored guests. The irony was unbearable. Rome, the empire of laws, had turned justice into ritualized cruelty. One senator later described the moment in a fragment preserved by a Christian chronicler. "I felt my arm betray me. The torch shook not because it was heavy, but because my soul could no longer hold it." That line, scrawled on parchment centuries ago, survives as one of the most haunting testimonies of the Roman world. It reveals not just physical cruelty, but the collapse of inner reality. When fathers become instruments of their children's humiliation, truth itself dissolves. Then came the entry that history remembers as Entry 247. A daughter of noble lineage no older than 14 was brought forward. Her name is lost to us, her humanity erased by the ledger's ink. What survives is the description: height 5 feet, hair dark, potential high. That's all the empire thought worth recording. That night, her father was ordered to hold the torch directly above her to keep the chamber illuminated. Witnesses recall that his hands burned from the heat, yet he did not let go. He couldn't. Because if he dropped the torch, his other children would take her place. This was the breaking point. Torch duty was no longer about obedience. It was about complicity. Fathers became unwilling collaborators in the emperor's spectacle. Rome's patriarchal ideal that a father's duty was to protect was inverted. Under Caligula, fatherhood meant destroying what you loved most with your own trembling hands. Psychologists today might call it cognitive collapse. Faith and reason buckle under such pressure. In that chamber, logic no longer applied. The law said family was sacred. Tradition said Rome was just. Religion said the gods demanded honor. Yet the emperor proved all of it could be rewritten with a single command. This was the moment when Rome's heart broke not with swords, but with silence. Eyewitness fragments describe fathers leaving the chamber with vacant stares, walking like ghosts across the forum. Some never spoke again. Others took their lives within days. Senators began wearing veils in public to hide their eyes, ashamed of what they had seen, ashamed of what they had done. And still, none dared to rebel. Because rebellion meant extinction. Survival meant silence. And so the cycle deepened. More ledgers, more torches, more names crossed out of life and into inventory. The empire functioned like clockwork, but its soul was bleeding. Citizens whispered that Rome itself had become cursed. Mothers began leaving offerings at crossroads, begging forgotten gods for protection. Slaves spread rumors that shadows followed them at night. Even soldiers hardened by campaigns in Germania admitted the palace felt unholy. Rome, once defined by conquest abroad, now trembled under conquest at home. But the most terrifying twist wasn't in the chambers. It was in the minds of the survivors. Fathers began to rationalize. Some convinced themselves they were saving others by complying. Others whispered that the emperor truly was divine because only a god could bend human love into obedience. And that is how horror works. It doesn't just destroy bodies. It rewrites beliefs. It bends reality until reason itself collapses. Historians call this the Caligula fracture. It's the moment when society no longer trusts its own values, when honor law and faith dissolve into instruments of fear. And once fractured, a civilization doesn't heal, it mutates. Rome never truly recovered. Later emperors would continue their own horrors, but the precedent was set. The crown could command the impossible, and citizens would obey. The chilling reality is that we still don't know the full scope of torch duty. Archaeologists have uncovered burned patches of marble where torches once dripped wax. Graffiti scratched into stone reads, "My eyes are ash." Ledgers confirm hundreds of entries, but how many more were lost? How many names were erased, not just from records, but from memory itself? Entry 247 remains a symbol not because it was unique, but because it was universal. Every father who held a torch lived that same nightmare. Every child reduced to a line in the ledger carried the same silence. And every senator who left the chamber faced the same impossible truth. Rome's greatness was built on ashes too dark to acknowledge. So here's the question. No historian can answer, but every viewer must confront. If you were there, would you have held the torch steady because that's what Caligula understood? Power doesn't just kill, it forces you to become part of the killing. And once you participate, even unwillingly, resistance becomes impossible. That is why his terror lasted. That is why his story still grips us 2,000 years later. And that is why the forbidden history of ancient Rome feels less like the past and more like a mirror. This was not madness. This was strategy, and it worked. Rome never woke up from that night. Even after the torches were extinguished, even after the ledgers were closed, the silence was worse than the screams. What survived was not just trauma, but transformation. The empire was no longer what it had been. It had become something darker, something fractured. And that fracture spread like cracks in marble, invisible at first, but fatal over time. The first wave of consequences was personal. Fathers who had once been respected senators now wandered like ghosts through the forum, unable to look one another in the eye. Shame had replaced honor. Silence had replaced speech. Fear had replaced law. Families fell apart. Wives whispered of husbands who could no longer sleep, who woke screaming that their hands were burning, though no flame was near. Children avoided their fathers, sensing the weight of unspoken guilt. The very foundation of Roman society, the family, was poisoned from within. The second wave was political. Caligula's experiment proved something horrifying. Obedience could be extracted not just through violence but through complicity. Senators who once prided themselves on resistance realized that the emperor had broken them without lifting a sword. By forcing them to destroy their own, he owned them completely. From that moment, the Senate became a hollow shell. Every decree, every law, every performance of duty was stained by the memory of torchlight. Rome's great political machine had turned into a stage for silent actors mouthing loyalty while bleeding inside. The third wave was cultural. Rome had long celebrated its heroes, fathers who defended families, generals who defended honor, emperors who defended tradition. But after torch duty, that narrative rang hollow. New graffiti began to appear in alleyways, crude drawings of torches dripping wax accompanied by words like "eyes of ash" or "fire that eats blood." Slaves told stories that the spirits of children lingered in the palace halls, weeping when no one listened. Mothers began tying small charms to their infants' wrists, desperate to protect them from imperial gaze. Fear was no longer political, it was spiritual. Rome itself felt cursed. And yet the most terrifying consequence wasn't in the streets or the Senate. It was in the minds of ordinary Romans. Torch duty had taught them something they could never unlearn, that no value, family, honor, law, even love was stronger than power. Once you know that you cannot return to innocence. A society that loses faith in its own values doesn't collapse overnight. It rots slowly until every gesture, every ritual, every oath feels hollow. Rome became a theater where everyone played roles they no longer believed in. The aftershocks rippled for generations. Later emperors, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, would inherit this fracture. They no longer needed to invent horrors. The precedent had already been set. An emperor could command the impossible, and Rome would obey. The blood of torch duty stained not just Caligula's reign, but the DNA of the empire itself. Even when Rome expanded its borders, even when it conquered new lands, inside it was hollow. The empire could win wars abroad, but it had already lost the war within. What's most disturbing is how little remains. The ledgers were partially destroyed. The chambers were remodeled. Official historians wrote around the events, leaving only cryptic fragments. Yet that silence is its own testimony. Because history isn't just about what survives, it's about what is deliberately erased. And when power erases memory, it erases identity. Rome's greatness survives in monuments and marble, but in its silence we hear the echoes of the children whose names were reduced to inventory. And here's where the story stops being ancient. Because the truth is, history never really ends. The tactics Caligula perfected still echo today. When regimes force citizens to betray family, when governments weaponize shame, when leaders demand obedience through complicity, they are not inventing anything new. They are repeating a formula written in torchlight 2,000 years ago. That is why this story matters, not because it is old, but because it is eternal. The question is not whether Rome fell. The question is whether we ever stop reliving its fracture. Think about it, the empire that ruled half the known world, that engineered aqueducts, roads, and laws, also engineered a system where love itself was destroyed in service of fear. What does that say about us, about the civilizations we build, about the illusions we cling to? And that brings us to the final, most chilling detail. Archaeologists working near the Palatine Hill recently uncovered a burned fragment of marble floor. Embedded in the stone were faint, blackened fingerprints, too small to belong to men. Children's hands. Their final trace preserved not in books, but in ash. 2,000 years later, their touch still lingers. So what are we left with? Not just history, not just legend, but a mirror. Rome's fracture is our fracture. Caligula's torch is still burning, and if history teaches us anything, it is this: power survives not by force, but by convincing us to become part of its cruelty. The macabre history of Rome doesn't end in the palace. It ends with us asking the only question that matters. If the torch was placed in your hand, would you hold it steady? Or would you let it fall? And if that question unsettles you, it should. Because that is the legacy of forbidden history. It refuses to stay buried. It refuses to let us sleep. It whispers in every silence, flickers in every shadow, and demands that we confront the truth: Rome never died. It lives in every compromise, every silence, every obedience to cruelty. So now it's your turn. What do you think? Could you have resisted, or would you, like so many others, have obeyed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want me to continue digging into the darkest, most disturbing stories history tried to erase, make sure you subscribe, share this video, and turn on notifications. Because this was just one chapter in the endless saga of the macabre history, and the next one might be even darker. You've just walked through a story that most textbooks would rather bury, a story that was designed to be forgotten. But here's the haunting truth. History doesn't disappear just because people try to erase it. It lingers in silence, in shadows, and in the way it reshapes the world that comes after. What happened in Rome was not just about one emperor or one night. It was about the terrifying fact that power, once it learns how to corrupt love itself, can survive forever in the cracks of every civilization. And maybe that's why you still feel unsettled even now. Because this isn't just about Rome, it's about us. The real question isn't how could they let this happen? The real question is, what would I have done? That's the fracture that history leaves inside each of us. Would you resist, or would you obey, convincing yourself you had no choice? I know that's not a comfortable question, but it's supposed to be uncomfortable. That discomfort is the whole point of the macabre history, to make us look straight into the darkest truths and realize that they are not just ancient stories. They are mirrors, and mirrors demand that we face ourselves. So before you scroll away, before the algorithm distracts you with something easier, sit with that question. Let it burn for a moment. And then I want you to tell me honestly what you think. Drop your answer in the comments below, even if it's just one word. Because these stories don't belong only to the past. They belong to the people who are willing to keep them alive. That means you. And if you felt something tonight, if this story made you question, made you shiver, or made you think differently about history, then don't let it vanish like so many erased names. Save this video, share it with someone who dares to hear the truth, and most importantly, hit subscribe right now. Because this was only one chapter. The next one will take us even deeper into the shadows. Remember this final truth. Empires fall, leaders die, but silence survives only when we allow it. Break that silence with me.